both sides of the family away.
That's right.
The stories would come out. So apparently, according to other journalists, we found out that there were a lot of porcupines probably told to the royals and even to Harry when they met her. And in order to cover up
a setup, I was set up by a guy named Jeff Rayner and another guy named Dylan Howard, who was with American Media, I think. And the whole thing was a plan to actually mess up the wedding. I was just part of it.
Before?
No, we were kind of puzzled when both sides of the family were kept away from the royal wedding. And we started wondering, what's up with this? Like, why? And we started to realize, when you have a wedding and people start drinking champagne at the reception, they start talking.
Right.
So what could the motive be for keeping both sides of the family away?
That's right.
The stories would come out. So
what if the person the world thinks it knows was never presented exactly as she really was? That question has lingered quietly for years around Meghan Markle, growing louder whenever old records, family memories, or forgotten images reappear. The public was given a simple and polished story. A woman born in 1981, a bright student, a struggling actress, and eventually a duchess. It was clean, inspiring, and easy to accept. But once a few loose threads began to show, some people started wondering whether the image had been edited long before the world ever saw it. In the world of celebrity, age is never just a personal detail. It shapes perception. It affects how someone is cast, how long they are seen as rising, and how easily they fit the story that public relations teams want to sell. A few years can change the entire mood of a biography. That is why the questions around Meghan's timeline have never fully disappeared. To some, they sounded petty. To others, they looked like the beginning of something much larger. One of the most talked about pieces of material was an old magazine issue that resurfaced and immediately caused confusion. A March issue of 17 magazine from the 1990s showed a young woman who many believed looked unmistakably like Meghan Markle. The striking part was not just the image, but the age printed beside it. The caption listed her as 21. If the official timeline were correct, she would have been only 15 or 16 at that time, still a teenager and still in school. People rushed to explain it away. Some said it had to be a typo. Others insisted it was someone else. But for those already suspicious, the detail felt too specific to dismiss so easily. It was a professionally published magazine, not a random rumor passed around online. Once that page began circulating, the doubts grew stronger. If the age in that feature had been accurate, the entire public timeline would shift. School years, college years, early jobs, and career milestones would all move into a different frame. What had been sold as the gradual rise of a younger actress would look more like the journey of someone older, more experienced, and further along than people had been told. That possibility turned a single caption into something far more explosive. It stopped being about one printed number and became a challenge to the whole carefully packaged life story. Family memories added even more tension to that picture. Samantha Markle had spent years being dismissed as the bitter half-sister, the difficult relative, the one nobody was supposed to take seriously. But her story never really changed. She kept saying that the public version of Meghan's life did not match the one she remembered. She spoke about a childhood and family history that felt very different from the lonely, struggling, almost self-created image later pushed into the spotlight. To many people, Samantha's tone made her easy to ignore. Yet the longer the controversy lasted, the more some observers began to wonder whether her anger had been overshadowing the possibility that she was pointing to real inconsistencies. Samantha's claims were never limited to age alone. What bothered her seemed to be the larger issue of authenticity. She remembered family events, stages of life, and shared experiences that, in her mind, no longer lined up with the official story. The person she described was not a mystery to her. She was a sister whose past had been polished until it no longer felt recognizable. For years, the public preferred the glamorous version because it was easier, more romantic, and far more appealing than a messy family dispute. But as old material kept resurfacing, that polished version began to look less untouchable. Then there was Thomas Markle, whose role made the whole issue even harder to ignore. He was not just Meghan's father. He was a man from Hollywood, someone who had spent his career working with light, mood, image, and illusion. He understood better than most people how reality could be shaped for an audience. He knew what a camera could hide and what presentation could do to the truth. Because he had documented so much of Meghan's early life through photographs and home videos, his uncertainty carried a different kind of weight. When he spoke about birthdays, milestones, graduations, and old family memories that did not seem to fit the official biography, people heard more than family resentment. They heard someone who felt his daughter's life had been turned into a production he no longer recognized. Old family photos and records only added to the unease. Some people studying those early images claimed Meghan appeared older than the official timeline would suggest. Others pointed to family cards, dates, and archived memories that they felt were difficult to reconcile with the accepted birth year. None of it came as one dramatic revelation. It arrived in fragments, in scattered details, in things that might have meant nothing on their own. Yet together, they created a lingering sense that the public had been given a biography stripped of rough edges and inconvenient questions. The deeper question was always why. If anything had been adjusted, what was the purpose? For critics, the answer was obvious. Hollywood has never been kind to women growing older, especially women trying to build a screen career. Being even a few years younger on paper could mean more opportunities, more desirable roles, and more time before the industry decided someone had passed her peak. In that environment, shaving years off a biography would not have been shocking. It would have been strategic. But once that kind of detail enters public records, contracts, press coverage, and official profiles, it becomes very difficult to reverse. By the time Meghan stepped onto the royal stage, the story may already have been too established to challenge without risking everything around it. That is what made the controversy so gripping. It was never just about one age, one magazine, or one argument inside a family. It was about whether a global public figure had been introduced to the world through a version of herself that was carefully managed from the start. And if that was true, then every polished chapter that followed would begin to look a little different. Once the questions around age and early records took hold, the conversation moved into even more sensitive territory. If the timeline had been adjusted, then people naturally wanted to know what else might have been shaped along the way. In Hollywood, reinvention is not unusual. Careers are built on controlled presentation, softened backstories, and selective truth. What matters is not always the full reality, but the version that works best in public. In that world, a cleaner biography can open doors. It can make someone look more promising, more relatable, and more marketable. A small change on paper can quietly reshape an entire future. That idea led many people back to the missing years in Meghan's early career. There were stretches of her story that seemed unusually thin, periods described in broad and flattering language, but without much solid detail. Instead of a fully connected path, there appeared to be convenient jumps from one stage to the next. Some observers described those as the waitress years, while others believed she was already moving through far more influential social spaces than the official version admitted. The more closely they looked, the less she seemed like a newcomer waiting for a lucky break, and the more she seemed like someone already learning how to navigate power, status, and opportunity. Rumors followed those gaps wherever they appeared. People whispered about old relationships, possible earlier commitments, and parts of her personal history that may have been scrubbed away because they did not fit the polished image. Whether those rumors were true or exaggerated, they fed a growing belief that the public had been given an edited character rather than a complete person. If Meghan was older and more socially established than she appeared, then the entire story of her rise changed. Her years in entertainment would no longer look like a struggle out of obscurity. They would look like the work of someone who had already spent a long time positioning herself inside the right circles. That shift matters most when the story reaches Prince Harry. The official version is charming and effortless. A mutual friend, a blind date in London, two people who instantly connected, and a romance that changed royal history. But under a harsher light, the same story begins to look far more strategic. If Meghan was already experienced in elite social environments, already comfortable around wealth, influence, and carefully managed spaces, then meeting Harry no longer feels like a random miracle. It begins to feel like the moment when a long-prepared path finally connected with the highest-profile opportunity of all. From there, the story moves into one of the most controversial areas in the entire debate: the pregnancy with Archie. Publicly, it was treated as a celebration, a joyful new chapter for the monarchy. But behind the scenes, the age questions made some royal watchers uneasy. If Meghan had really been born in 1981, she would have been in her late 30s when Archie was born. That would still be medically common, even if doctors classify it as a later pregnancy. But if the alternative timeline were true, and she was actually several years older, the situation would look very different. The pregnancy would fall into a much more delicate category, and the image of everything being effortless would become harder to believe. That is where the secrecy around the birth began to stand out. Royal births had long followed a recognizable pattern, with official announcements, medical details, and visible procedures that gave the public confidence everything had happened within tradition. Meghan's birth story felt different from the beginning. There were no doctors standing publicly outside the hospital in the familiar way people had come to expect. There were no detailed medical bulletins presented with the same level of openness seen in other royal births. Instead, everything felt tightly controlled, unusually private, and carefully managed. To supporters, that looked like a modern couple protecting their personal life. To critics, it looked like another carefully sealed part of a much larger image operation. The mystery only deepened after Prince Harry described the birth in Spare. His account was emotional, vivid, and highly cinematic. He wrote about the atmosphere of the room, the mood, the music, and even about using the laughing gas meant for Meghan. It read like a scene from a film, intimate and dramatic, designed to pull the reader straight into the moment. But for many people, that was exactly the problem. The more polished the story sounded, the more some readers felt it moved away from ordinary reality. Medical professionals and skeptical observers pointed out that the timeline Harry described did not sound as simple and smooth as he made it appear, especially for a first-time mother in her late 30s or older. The speed of the process, the quick exit, and the almost magical recovery left critics with more questions than reassurance. Taken together, the pregnancy and birth story began to feel to some people less like a transparent family event and more like another chapter shaped for public consumption. The details that might have grounded it in ordinary fact were either absent or glossed over. Instead, the world was given a version that felt elegant, emotionally satisfying, and difficult to verify. That may have worked for many people at the time, but for those already suspicious of timeline inconsistencies, it only strengthened the belief that the public kept being shown the polished version first. This is where the idea of branding becomes impossible to ignore. When Meghan entered royal life, she did not just marry into a family, she became part of a global image machine. Everything about her story gained symbolic weight. She was presented as modern, intelligent, compassionate, and transformative. To keep that symbol strong, any awkward detail from the past would become a problem. Age discrepancies, family disputes, vague career gaps, and uncomfortable questions would all need careful handling. In Hollywood, that sort of cleanup is routine. But inside the royal family, where image is tied to centuries of ritual, duty, and historical continuity, the consequences are far greater. That clash between Hollywood-style narrative management and royal tradition was always going to be dangerous. Some people came to believe the palace itself may have helped smooth over the rough edges in the beginning because the institution wanted the story to succeed. Meghan was exciting, globally appealing, and unlike anyone who had entered the family before. She looked like the future. But the more accusations surfaced, the more archived material came back into view, and the louder family members became, the harder it became to keep every part of the image under control. The story that was meant to look seamless began to show strain. At that point, the issue had grown far beyond one disputed detail. It had become a struggle between public perception and uncomfortable possibility. For millions of admirers, these questions felt like cruelty disguised as curiosity. For skeptics, they felt necessary, especially when such enormous public influence was involved. Either way, the polished fairy tale was no longer enough on its own. Too many shadows had started forming behind it. By the time the story reached its later stages, the biggest issue was no longer one old caption, one family memory, or one missing detail. It was the sheer power of repetition. Once a public story is told enough times, with enough confidence and enough polish, people stop treating it like a version and start treating it like the truth itself. That is what made Meghan's image so powerful. She was presented as the modern Duchess, a woman of intelligence, ambition, grace, and resilience, stepping into one of the oldest institutions on Earth and forcing it to face a new era. It was a story people wanted to believe. It was elegant, emotional, and easy to repeat. But repetition has its own dangers. The more polished a story becomes, the more suspicious every rough edge starts to look. Old records do not disappear just because a new version is more attractive. Family memories do not vanish because the media prefers a cleaner narrative. Archived photos do not stop existing because the public has moved on. Slowly, those forgotten pieces began resurfacing, and each one pulled attention back toward the same uncomfortable possibility. What if the official version was only the most marketable one? That question became even sharper when people looked back at the years leading up to the famous blind date in 2016. The fairy tale version was simple. Meghan was a hard-working actress, living her independent life. A mutual friend arranged an introduction, and everything changed from there. But old photos from Soho House and whispers about those circles began to complicate that image. These were not the pictures of someone standing on the edge of opportunity and hoping to get lucky. They were the images of someone already moving through highly exclusive social spaces, already close to wealthy and influential networks, already comfortable in environments where privacy, access, and status meant everything. Soho House became one of the most talked about symbols in that story because it represented far more than nightlife or fashionable connections. It stood for entry into a world where the right faces, the right timing, and the right alliances could change a life. If Meghan had already been deeply familiar with those circles, then the story of sudden royal destiny became harder to accept at face value. Instead of a chance encounter that transformed a relatively unknown actress, the romance could be viewed as the culmination of years spent learning exactly how elite spaces worked. In that light, the blind date looked less like fate and more like the moment a carefully built social path reached its ultimate destination. That naturally led to the palace itself. Buckingham Palace is not a casual household. It is a fortress of protocol, security, and institutional memory. Nothing connected to the monarchy's future is supposed to pass through without scrutiny. Backgrounds are checked, relationships are studied, reputations are assessed, and risks are measured long before the public is allowed to see a polished smile on a palace balcony. That is why so many people kept returning to the same question. If there were serious inconsistencies in Meghan's history, how could the palace have missed them? And if it did not miss them, why did it still move forward? One answer is simple. The monarchy may have wanted a success story badly enough that it chose not to look too closely at the cracks. Meghan represented youth, energy, glamour, and global attention. She offered a powerful new image at a time when the institution desperately needed relevance. In that situation, rough edges might have seemed manageable, especially if the larger public response was enthusiastic. Another answer is darker. The palace may have known far more than it ever intended to reveal and simply kept a fuller picture in reserve. In powerful institutions, information is rarely discarded. It is stored, it becomes leverage, insurance, and protection. If that was the case, then the later fallout between Meghan and the palace starts to look different. The public was shown a battle about press intrusion, family pain, and emotional isolation. All of that may have been real in some form. But beneath it, there may also have been a deeper struggle over control of the story itself. If Meghan felt that the institution either had her real history locked away or had once helped sanitize it and then turned cold, her decision to step away and speak publicly would take on a very different meaning. It would not just be an act of defiance. It would be an attempt to reclaim control before someone else decided to shape the ending for her. That is why so many people began rewatching interviews, documentaries, and public appearances with a different eye. The editing felt more noticeable. The emotional beats felt more deliberate. The spontaneous moments no longer looked completely spontaneous. The dramatic revelations that once seemed raw and shocking began to look, to some viewers, like carefully chosen disclosures designed to pull attention towards certain truths while keeping deeper questions buried. The more people noticed that pattern, the more they felt they were not seeing a life unfold naturally. They were watching competing narratives fight for dominance. In the end, the story stops being only about Meghan Markle. It becomes a warning about modern public life itself. In an age of branding, media control, and endless performance, the most visible people are often the most carefully edited. A biography can be repeated until it feels undeniable. A polished image can become stronger than conflicting evidence simply because it is easier to consume. A public figure can look completely exposed, while the most important parts of the story remain hidden behind legal caution, public relations strategy, and selective revelation. That is what gives the controversy its lasting pull. The issue is not just whether one date was wrong or whether one old record was misunderstood. The issue is whether an entire identity was constructed so effectively that the world accepted it before asking who built it and why. Once that question takes hold, everything starts to look different. Old photos feel less harmless. Family voices sound less easy to dismiss. Public appearances seem less accidental. The official script no longer feels complete. And that is where the story leaves people now, standing between two versions of the same life. One version is polished, inspiring, and familiar. The other is fragmented, disputed, and far less comfortable. The more material resurfaces, the harder it becomes to believe the polished version is the whole truth. And once people begin looking behind the curtain, it becomes almost impossible to stop.